Welcome. This is our third and final series in our Walking in the Footsteps of Grief, our Advent series at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. We have now perfected audio thanks to Mike Patch and his mad skills. So we hope that you will go back and listen to the first two sessions that were posted on our YouTube station and on Facebook. And last week we had Joyce Bailey, and the week before was my session and the introduction. Those are available for you. Tonight we have two speakers. We have our very own Louise Williams, who's going to open for us tonight, and we are grateful to you for agreeing to do this. This is a hard thing to do, as Joyce and I can both say, but we appreciate your standing in this place. And we are also grateful to our deacon, the Reverend Deacon Bill Bumgarner, who is going to close us out with some shared collective gatherings of wisdom.
Personal and community.
There we go, personal and community. What could be better? And I hope also that we will have some opportunities in the weeks and months ahead to continue these conversations. So if you are online or if you are in this room and you would like to continue some conversations about grief in a structured way where we can come together, please do be in touch with me or with Bill. I'm going to make that offer tonight. So thank you for being with us, and thanks especially to Mike for helping us make this available to the worldwide web, and to Sumner Jenkins for making sure that people are fed and that people are here and the lights are on and the doors are closed and locked and all the other things. So we're grateful to everyone who has been here in person and online. I'm going to unhook, so excuse any audio dissonance here.
Hi, I'm Louise Williams. My story is not going to be anything like Joyce and Nina had, kind of the total opposite. I'll start my story. I guess it would be, as a child, I lived in a home that was not very happy. My parents had a very volatile relationship. My sister and I would never know what the mood in the house would be. My father was not a very happy man, to say the least. There were times when they wouldn't say a word to each other. One time for 18 months, another time for 9 months. And my sister and I would come home from school, and they would be talking as if the 18 months had never existed. My life changed my sophomore year when I met the love of my life. We have been together for 60 years, for 58 married. We married right out of high school. All college was done at night. We had our first daughter, Luann, 2.5 years later, and Jennifer, 20 months later. Our family life was much different than our childhood. John's parents were divorced, and mine should have been. Our Christmas were always festive and happy, unlike when I was a child, and my father usually would pick a fight the week before Christmas. Devastating for a child, but as an adult, we would concentrate on our own family. John and I would never know which one was coming for dinner. John worked at IFF and went to school at night. Our family was doing great. We always said we would never put our children through what we did have. Our children were off to college, and right before Luann left, my father was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. My job at that time was with Halston Fragrance and was relocating to North Carolina. Obviously, I did not want to move. I had a year off, so I took care of my father for 6 months. At that time, they were separated again. My sister was pregnant and dealing with a new child. In September, 3 weeks before he passed, he allowed my mother to come back to care for him. I think they needed this, and God knows I did. I was totally exhausted. So on Friday night, I told John I was going to check on them both. While there, John called crying
his mother unexpectedly dropped dead on a dance floor at the American Legion building where she lived. So one Tuesday we buried his mother, and then to see my father, I went to see my father, and he looked at me and said, "It's time to go." He passed, we took him to the hospital, or an ambulance took him to the hospital. He passed away the next day. We had 2 funerals in 1 week. My mother became a different person. Life was good, Christmases were great, and no more drama. This may sound cold, but if you knew what Christmas was like before, I said to Nina, my Christmases became happier after. That may sound terrible, but if you've had unhappy Christmases all your life, okay. So my mother, as I said, became a different person. All this went on for about 7 years. Our girls were out of college and both were married. Within 9 months of each other, and 2.5 years later, we had 2 grandsons. And 2 years later, we had 2 more. We were in New Jersey, and Jennifer and Philip were coming in for Christmas on the 23rd. Let me see. Oh, I'm sorry, I went ahead of myself. Okay, they were both out of college. Okay, so we were in New Jersey, and Jen and Philip were coming in on Christmas Eve. So on the 23rd, they went to Philip's family's farm. Granddaddy was going to the construction barn to cut a piece of wood. He was doing a board for Hot Wheels for the kids. Granddaddy Andrew wanted to go with him, and Granddaddy put him by the door. And unbeknownst to Granddaddy, Andrew came up behind him and grabbed the piece of wood just as the saw was shut down. Our grandson lost 2 fingers that day. They rushed into the hospital where the family looked for the fingers, only to find 1. When arriving at the hospital, Dr. Fuller immediately called Duke. They said it could be reattached, but he would have pain and trouble all his life. It would be sensitive to cold weather, etc. They said he would probably get frostbite if he ever went skiing or whatever. So they chose not to attach the 1 finger because they never found the second. So this family loves sports, and it was an extremely difficult time. I'll let you know, Andrew's 29 now and thriving, and feisty, but he was feisty as a baby, so I don't think it has anything to do with his lost fingers. There's a couple of funny stories. When his youngest brother was in, I think, kindergarten, wasn't it, John? Yeah. Somebody asked how his brother lost his 2 fingers, and he said a shark bit them off. And then another time in shop class when Andrew was in high school, the teacher was giving instructions for the saws and the equipment, and he said, I don't want anybody leaving here without all their fingers. And Andrew went like this to him because the teacher did not know, and obviously the class, everybody laughed. I mean, Andrew was used to it by this time, and this happened when he was 4, almost 5 years old. So anyway, that is my story. John and I have had a good life together, and we've had a happy family, and we have great daughters, and luckily they come from 2 families that are also, the parents have pretty much similar to us, even though both sets are 10 years older than us. We've been great friends with them. When we used to come and visit, or even now, if it's his family's turn to have Thanksgiving and I have Christmas, we're always invited to each other's. And the same when we go out to Little Rock and my son-in-law Dan's family comes in, we make sure that his parents and us always overlap a night. So it doesn't have to, history does not have to repeat itself. So you can always make a better life for yourself. And that's my story. And And don't get in the car and think you're the love of my life all the time.
I could have used John you were talking about.
I could have used better billing than what you gave me, I think.
And you? Okay, let's see how I can. How's that?
Gotta cut it on.
Hmm?
Cut it on.
Oh, it's on? But you did that. Okay,
Got it.
I'm going to stand, because I'm going to use the chair, as I've got a few materials I'm going to refer to, so if you'll tell me, make sure I'm in the right place for you. And have a little bit of wine just to help my speech flow more freely. So. Is that good? Okay. Well, my presentation is going to be a little different than I think maybe you've had over these today and the last two. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and some history coming into the church, and a little bit of that because it does have an impact on how grief, the major times in my life that there's been big moments of grief, and I'll talk a little bit about grief itself, and also give some closure that I hope gives you some things that you can draw on as you deal with grief in your life. I think much of what we talk about, and the big moments of grief that are the big moments of loss are the things that fill our life the most and stay with us the longest. But we have grief in our life every day, in some form or fashion. Just little moments, things that may disappoint us in relationships, in interchanges with people, with what's going on in the world. At any rate, I'm going to try to close that, maybe draw some of the feelings together and things I've seen. And I'm approaching this from a Christian environment, but not, it goes beyond that. So I hope that it makes some sense to you. Well, I'm Bill Bumgarner, deacon. I've been this Friday I will be ordained 16 years as a deacon in the Episcopal Church. On All Saints Day, I would have been here at St. Paul's for 12 years as my home church. Before that, I was at St. Stephen's, and I became a Christian there and was ordained. I was baptized and confirmed by Louis Fisher as an adult at 25 years old, 24, 25, I forget now, 1979. I came from an unchurched environment. My dad did read the Bible, but he worked. He was a foundry worker. So he had a little time to go to church. But he read the Bible every day. And so he had his own, and it stuck with him his whole life, a very simple, but grounded in the Bible. So he knew God, and as I know, I'll tell you later about his death a bit. I knew that he was prepared in dealing with all the grief and he faced in life and the joy that came after. As I said, I became a Christian in my 20s. I came to the Episcopal Church through Sheldon Van Auken as much as anything else. With St. Stephen's, who was a professor, a history and English professor at Lynchburg College. I had several classes with him and got to know him. I went to other meetings and things with him and experienced a challenge in learning from him. And that was drawing me to faith. And I was already drawn to faith because it was like, I need to know more. I need to learn. And I wanted to learn. I'll go back by saying, I don't know that most of you know, and maybe you don't recognize it, but maybe you do, that I'm an introvert. My comfort zone is I could be alone very often and do my things. And by comfort zone, I mean that when I am in community, which I'll explain, I've been in community much of my life as I became a Christian and beyond, I was drawn out by faith. But again, that's my comfort zone. I became, and I on purpose went into sales, which you might think that makes no sense whatsoever. However, it does in the sense that 25% of the people in sales are introverts, 25% are extroverts, 25% are amiables. And so it's broken down that way. We connect with different people in different ways. But I will tell you that being in front of people, being in situations where you're on, is tiresome. I was a sales manager, both a salesman and a sales manager through much of my career. I worked, to talk about stress, I worked for Nina's uncle, Jim Vest. And if anybody knows Jim, and also her father, his brother, Jim's brother, they were the exact opposite. And Jim, both were good Episcopalians and one a bishop. But Jim was VMI. You say you still at all your blessings you end with God Bless America. That was Jim. So I worked for him, and actually he was a great supporter of mine. But from a stress standpoint and being on in front of people, I have to have my time to be away, to decompress and have my own time. But I cannot think of a better career combined with the church and all of. When I came to the church, Louis Fisher was the rector at St. Stephen's out in Forest, and I remember sitting with him, and we were talking about, my first wife and I with him, about joining the church there, and I said, I want to come to learn. I want to come to know Christ. I want to learn. This is not a social event for me as far as I'm concerned. That came back to bite me. In the sense that then over time I began to fully realize through Louis and the church and learning our faith that we are social. We are a corporate, we are a communion. We're a community of faith. When one of us hurts, we all hurt. Remember that as I go through some of my presentation here. Because I will just say that much of the things you read and much of the things you feel, the grief is personal and totally personal. As a Christian, and a couple of resources I'll let you may already know, we're drawn into community, and when one of us suffers, we all suffer in some form or fashion. We grieve for strangers when we see things on television about disasters and such. It's not the same, there are different degrees of grief as we are our own each experience. That's the personal part. But as Christians, we also know that we are not alone. God is with us all the time, and there's nothing that can separate us from Him. So we're not alone. And we're not alone in the sense that He calls us out in the sense of love God as He loves you, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how do you do that without feeling grief and sharing pain with people around you, whether it be your neighbor, whether it be people of your church? Again, I'm speaking that community does play a part in faith, plays a part in grief. God created us and gave us the capacity for love. With that, the greater capacity of love also brings the greater capacity for grief. We've got a quote I want to share that will set the tone a bit. And this is from James Patterson, who's a psychologist and a chaplain. I quote, "No one cries much unless something of real worth is lost. So grieving is a celebration of the depth of the union. Tears are jewels of remembrance, sad, but glistening with the beauty of the past. I think that's a wonderful reflection on at least one aspect of considering grief and love. I don't think you can have one without the other. Just keep that in mind as I go forward. At any rate, I came to the church, got very active. St. Stephen's, I did everything under the sun. Senior warden 3 times, vestry 3 times. Then I decided that was too much. I got to become a deacon, so I don't have to do that anymore. During that time, I'm going to speak very briefly about several moments of the greatest grief in my life. The first one, and all of these were during being a part of the church. The first was divorce. My daughter was 2 years old. I'd been married 10 years. And divorce was not something that was even considered. Out of that came, through faith and the support of community and the people around me, family, the church, the family, my outlaws, who are still close, we are close to this day, came the help in the process of dealing with grief. The grief there is one that in many ways could not have turned out better, in the sense of the grief was most, I can remember helping move furniture and suddenly just falling to the ground weeping, because it came to the realization that at least part of my daughter's life I was not going to be able to share fully. And to this day, there are moments when I'm still not able to share fully all the time with everything that surrounds her and my grandchildren, because of that, because of family. And a broad family, which I'll explain also, that became a wonderful, extended, beautiful family for both me and my daughter, for my wife, Mary Lynn. My outlaws were always kind to me. They were always supportive. Mary Lynn and I would go to Florida and spend a week with them without my daughter. I performed the marriage of my ex-niece. My sister-in-law actually got Mary Lynn and I together. We shared many times when this extended family was here in Lynchburg, or even in California, where if we were out there visiting, where we gathered as a large family. So from the standpoint of my daughter, it could not have been much more beautiful, in the sense it was this large, wonderful, loving family all around her. And again, loving around me and Mary Lynn is also. So out of that level of grief that still at time hits me because of feeling of a loss of not being able to share fully some things, we're all very close, and things we could not have been more civil and amiable as we went on in life. But nevertheless, that is one of those points of grief that continues to go with me to this day. The second point of grief also happened a few years later, and this was my mother's death. I went to work with Jim Vest at Piedmont Label. I came home. This was my birthday, May 12th. I came home, and Mary Lynn greeted me at the door, and she had called George Bean, Reverend George Bean, who was the most wonderful soul that ever was. I think he was at St. John's at one time, and just a wonderful human being. He was there. Anyway, Mary Lynn greeted me at the door and said my mother died in her sleep that morning. my mother's health was not good, and in one sense it was a blessing because she had a few mental health issues, she had other things. My dad was a caregiver to her. So the blessing was that her passing before my dad, because it would have been an awful time for her. But nevertheless, it's like a shock that just, you go, didn't expect that. Her health, I mean, she had health issues, but when she was 65, mid-60s, I got to roll dates around again to remember her age. But that was the second point of grief, large grief in my life. But then there are other little things, not little, but job situations. I lost a job, and over time, this was before that, before I went to Piedmont Label and worked with Jim Vest for 25 years. Talk about stress. I love Jim. We became very close because we both served on executive board and financial stuff together. And Jim was always, no, we're not spending that money. No. A true conservative and a lovely, caring human being in his very kind of gruff way at times. One more point, and the last one of great grief, is the more recent one of the death of my father. And even before that, my dad died at 90 in 2020, the end of 2020, at the height of COVID, with COVID. Before that, I would say there was 6 years I was doing a lot of caregiving for him, but also, I mean, first at home, and then for the last 5 years, he was in assisted living. He had dementia and Alzheimer's, which my dad hid well because him and his brothers and sisters all had a great gift of gab. They never met people that they didn't know. That dad was able to hide some of his dementia and things because I always said, my dad's full of baloney, you know, and he was. He drew people to him and with him by picking and hey, let me tell you something. Come. That's what he did to the assisted living people. Come here, let me tell you something. And I would go, this is not going to be a minute. If he says come a minute, you got to be prepared for 15 at least, maybe 30. And Dad had that until his death. That gift, even with dementia, he disarmed people, everybody at assisted living. Everybody loved my dad. For me, as an only child, which is another thing about being an introvert, I was an only child. I didn't add that earlier. That didn't help maybe it helped cause being an introvert, you know. But it was both a blessing and a curse because Dad just kind of went here with everything as his dementia. And I could have probably been engaged doing everything for him as far as financial and other things much sooner. But he hid things so well with his gift of gab and he was just always joking, and there's a joy always about him. And I'll share that I finally was able to do his funeral service, a graveside, which is kind of a normal Bumgarner kind of thing, more of a graveside service, although I expanded it more to more of our Episcopal faith to an extent, with more readings and such than just your typical graveside burial. And I read the lesson that we read today, the gospel, about the many rooms in the mansion. And what I said about my dad and also about my uncles and his brothers and sisters were, the room that they're all in is the front porch. They're up there all together, joking, laughing, doing all this gab back and forth, and they're going, St. Peter, rushing somebody in, and they go, come on in. They were sitting on the front porch like we did so many times on a glider. You know, those porch swings that we sat there as I grew up. My dad did that most of his life. There's still one at the home place, which I just finally sold to a cousin. That's what Bumgarners do. They just kind of sit and talk and laugh. And that was my dad. That's the blessing that he left with me. The blessing that the grief part was more in the sense of this was at the height of the pandemic. I couldn't see him. I really couldn't do much anything other than look through a window and see him for his last 3 months. And Dad had dementia, so that wasn't an easy thing either, because my dad went through this last several years of having a kind of a permanent UTI. And just, if you know anything about those, urinary tract infections in an older person, it magnifies other things that are going on in your system. And if you've got dementia, Alzheimer's, it only magnifies that. I can remember being at Westminster Canterbury during one of my dad's major episodes of that, seeing my dad, and he was hallucinating about, I can't remember which one that was, he hallucinated about a lot of things, about seeing that his mother called and he had to go to Evanston to go pick up his brother or something, those type of things. All I can remember is coming out and walking down the hall with the nurses, and it suddenly just hit me. And I was overcome just weeping. Because the realization was fully that my dad was no longer quite my dad. He was, but he wasn't, and I know, that is it's a terrible disease. That made it hard, and I could not be with him at his death. And part of that was because Mary Lynn and I have had to shut our lives down quite a bit over the last 2 to 3 years, because my father-in-law will be 100 in May 1st. He's living by himself. Shouldn't be, really, but he's determined. He's an engineer. That's who he is. And with that, we have to be very careful, because we're the only connection to him in the world. Mary Lynn does so much for him, and has for several years now. Therefore, I have to be careful. I do some things for him, nothing to the stress and obligation and love that my wife has with her father. But that has changed part of our life for the last several years with the pandemic. Even now, Mary Lynn and I went away in late October. We went for the first time in a long time on a trip to Savannah. We came back. I had COVID. I vaccinated to the hilt. We were very careful. We went on this trip. She didn't get it. I did. I went immediately to the basement and lived there for about 2 weeks until I tested negative, to protect her, to protect her father. That's had an impact on our interaction at church also, because of all of that, about being careful about him, about being, for instance, I knew that, like, my dad got COVID, he was going to die, and he did. He had it, it was less than a week, and he was gone because of other issues he had. Jim being 100, or soon to be 100, there's a razor-thin point of life that anything pushes him over the edge. God bless, he's still with us, though. Stubborn, but he's in a world to his own. And we've been very protective of that. That, combined with my dad's death, the pandemic has been a large point of grief for me and Mary Lynn as well, my wife, because we've had to shut down. And that's been painful, because the church has been, especially for both of us, because she's been very active, but for me, the church has been a place where I have been nurtured, the faith, the community of faith. I've been nurtured by both friendship and also mentoring. Louis Fisher at St. Stephen's was a great mentor. I've seen acts through him. And there's one other point of grief that I'll share briefly that Louis is very much a part of. We had a very good friend and somewhat of a mentor herself, Pat Colby. She was Pat Rosser. Her husband, Shirley Rosser, passed away, but a Lynchburg College professor. He had 2 children who I became very close to. They're my brother and sister. I'm an only child, and they're my little brother, my little sister. David Rosser, who's on the trustees at Lynchburg College, and Elizabeth, his sister. Became very close, especially, we were always reasonably close, but then especially after Shirley died, and Pat then remarried to a wonderful man that she came to me and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Do it. You're a loving, beautiful human being. You have love and life to give." And she was a light of life. I mean, full of life. She lit up the room, and so does her daughter and son both. They have that same light. But anyway, when Pat was ill with pancreatic cancer, this was well before my father's death, we were all very close. And there were special moments and I speak of them because there are moments that in grief there is learning, there is sharing, there is things in your life that you will remember the rest of your life that God was present. The first one was when hospice had been called in, and Elizabeth and I and Mary Lynn, hospice person, Pat was in a bed over to the side. Pat was very quiet, wasn't really being very responsive. With hospice, we started praying. We each prayed, and in a pause, Pat from her bed started praying for us. We didn't even know that she was knowing what was going on. But she was praying for us. I mean, talk about community. Talk about love. Talk about sharing with grief and supporting each other. What an example there. Pat passed away, I don't know, a week later or less. Louis Fisher. We were there at the morning of Pat's death, and Elizabeth's there. David was on the way, but he wasn't there yet. Charlotte and Louis Fisher, and Louis Fisher was a longtime rector at St. Stephen's, and one who helped bring me to be whatever Christian, good or bad, I am, into this faith. Louis was having a debilitating disease. His mind was at least partially there. I forget what it was called, but his body was shut. It was so shut he couldn't move. It was very little movement. He could barely speak at all, and then finally he couldn't speak at all. And when he did speak, it was disjointed. He was in a wheelchair, and his wife Charlotte rolled him in. Elizabeth was sitting there, and he came over to Elizabeth, made the sign of the cross on her forehead. And, you didn't even know if Lou was quite all there. Well, he was there at that moment being a priest and sharing the love of Christ in all of the pain and I think somewhat bewilderment and things that were going on with him and his body. That's the one moment I will say that I know God was present then. I will never forget that. That leads me to in a roundabout way, to say that grief is very personal in one sense. In another sense, it is corporate. And we are a community of faith. God calls us together as a community. And so how I've been called in life, very early on, not long after Louis Fisher, and then a few things at St. Stephen's, of service. Calling to be serving others, and at least being a listener. I became a Stephen minister, a Stephen leader, which helped train Stephen ministers, and then a Stephen minister after that. And that's been probably the most fulfilling both training and experience of my life. And that's a service and a very much personal, face-to-face, one-on-one sharing of somebody's grief, whatever it may be, for as long as a year or two. Meeting with them every week or two. Sharing, listening, and pastoral care. You know, the training that any of us clergy get, you know, at some level, whether a deacon, we aren't required to have a full CPE course. Priests obviously do, and many go on to have multiple classes. I will still say that my Stephen ministry was the best training I could have had in helping people, and with my introverted nature and other stuff, face-to-face, one-on-one, listening, sharing with people. I've missed some of that in the pandemic. I had to shut that down. I mean, everybody shut down. I will say that as we have come back into the church a little more active, maybe a lot more active, hopefully, been able to pick that up again a bit. There's been a grief that was missing. And it's a part of a path, a process about grief. It's a process about your gifts that you've been given in life. As a chaplain, some of the chaplain work that I've done, I did some at Westminster, I did some at Central Health, part of my early training. The most tragic thing was meeting with people who had nothing, nobody. They felt they had nobody. They had no support group, they had no faith, they had no family. They may have had it, but as far as they knew or figured, they didn't exist. So they had nothing. And yet, if they're meeting with a chaplain, at least they're searching. And in some of those moments, often those moments where you never knew if you made any difference or not. But in some of those moments, you saw where people at least had some aspect of coming in dealing with their grief and their situation, whether it was their health was leading to death or whether it was whatever it may be. God was present. They may not have been hearing him or listening. They weren't prepared. That's what much of being part of the creation of God and his free will he gives us is we have to be listening. We have to be open. We have to be present and desirous of this path, this process of calling us out of ourselves and calling us to God. And that's what's missing in a lot of people's lives. And God's not going anywhere. He's there, and hopefully during some time in their life and during grief, he doesn't let them go. Doesn't let you go. That's why I'm so adamant that grief, that love and grief are not personal, totally personal. We are a community of faith. This church is, Christ created the church, his community of faith. He came as a man. God came as man. That's what we're going to celebrate here in another 10 days or so, or a week. He came. He wept. He suffered. He felt grief. He showed us that he felt grief. He showed us that he felt pain. He showed us his true self. And then he calls us out to go, come, be open, listen, act. That's what I felt much of my life as I began to meet Louis Fisher early on. That's a path that I've been drawn to. Everybody has different paths in their life and different gifts. One of the major gifts that I've been given is to be a bit of a searcher and very much one, in my introverted way, a listener. And that's what a lot of people need. It's just people to listen to them and that they know somebody's listening to them in whatever is going on in their life. You say this, I'm a deacon, I'm ordained. Well, you know what? Our faith and Scripture says that we are all ministers. There are more of you as lay than there are clergy. We are all ministers. We're all called to this path in some form or fashion. We're called. We are a community. We are called. And in our search for dealing with grief is one that we share. We share with each other. I feel your pain. I feel, no, I mean, when I heard your story, my heart hurt. God gave us that gift, to be that, feel that compassion. That helps us both. That draws me to a different place, to a better place. I'm one of still learning and being more compassionate and understanding of what's going on, taking my shoes off and putting on somebody else's to understand what's going on in their life. I offer these thoughts up as a path that fits all of us in some form or fashion, wherever you are, in small steps, in larger steps. It's there. God is always there. The faith, and there are many rooms in the mansion, so it doesn't have, we're at an Episcopal church. Well, there are many mansions, and many rooms, and those rooms are filled with other denominations that may speak and draw you more, or with family and others. I ask, be open, be searching, reach beyond yourself. When we enfold on ourselves, we die in little increments. It is in giving that we receive. I don't think there's any better explanation than it is in giving that we receive. When I give, I receive. When I've visited people in whatever, whether it's doing things for neighbors, visiting neighbors, whether it's a ministry of actual visitation of grief, or whether I go mow the grass for somebody I know, like my next door neighbor, who I know they can't do it, and I like doing it. I'm better off. I gain more than they do. And that's much about, I know John, Louise, and others here are Eucharistic ministers who bring communion to folks. You gain more.
Sometimes we come out of it, we get just as much, if not more, from being there with them. We do.
Yeah.
And Susan.
And Susan especially, with her beautiful harp and voice, bringing such light to lives that may not even be people of faith. But the light of Christ is there at that moment. And there, you make it known. I'm going to end with I think the last thing I really have to say, we're offering up a couple of books. Good Grief. And this is not like good grief, not that kind of expression. No, this is much of what I've talked about tonight is in this little book. Doug Wigner put me on this book years ago. It's a very simple little book, but it does talk about us as Christians, about us being, in some way, ministers. Doesn't say it quite in those words. The other is a classic book, The Wounded Healer. Again, this kind of speaks, you'd think it's speaking to ministers, or clergy. Well, we are all ministers. This is a wonderful book that, again, helps you, it may give you something in your life to help the process of grief and maybe a path in your faith. I'm going to end with one reading, and it's the one reading I love more than any. It's a prayer in our prayer book. It's a prayer of St. Francis. Let us pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much to seek to be consoled as to console, To be understood as to understand. To be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Thank you all. I hope I've made some sense.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.